Over the last couple of weeks, I've been trying out Affinity Designer now that it became free. As someone who has used Inkscape for more than 10 years, this was something I had honestly been dreading for a while. And I'm not going to lie, I was right to dread it. Affinity Designer is, in many ways, a superior piece of software than Inkscape. As painful as it is for me to say that out loud, almost everything Inkscape does, Designer tends to do it faster, more smoothly, and with fewer technical problems. On top of that, it includes modern features and workflow improvements that Inkscape can only dream of right now. After seriously testing it, I can't honestly recommend Inkscape over Designer to a newcomer purely on technical merit. Designer is simply the more advanced software, and for many people, it's probably the better investment of time. And yet, I still think beginners should try Inkscape first. I still use it, and I still recommend it. Maybe part of that is familiarity, maybe it's because open source software creates a different kind of trust than privately owned software, or maybe it's because I genuinely believe there is something valuable about software that belongs to a community instead of a corporation. In any case, this video isn't really about Inkscape versus Affinity Designer. What I actually want to talk about is open source software itself and whether it's still worth using in a world where technically superior alternatives exist. I have pretty strong opinions about this, and if you're starting out learning digital art or design software, I think this is something important to keep in mind. So if you're planning to invest time learning a new graphic program, I recommend watching this video until the end. Let's begin by acknowledging something obvious. When it comes to graphic software specifically, paid proprietary software is usually better. Now, if we are talking about something like operating systems, server software, or programming tools, the conversation becomes more complicated. Open source competes extremely well there. But graphic software has special demands. It benefits enormously from large budgets. More testing, more developers, more optimization, more polish, more debugging, more UX design, and more advanced features. All of that costs an incredible amount of money. There are many graphic programs with amazing potential that sadly end up stagnating simply because they don't have the funding or manpower to keep evolving. A great example is Friction, a program I've mentioned before on the channel as a possible alternative to Adobe After Effects. After testing it seriously, I just couldn't justify using it for real work. It's not there yet, and considering it's being developed by a single guy, it may take years before it gets there, if it ever does. And that's unfortunate, because Friction has a lot of potential and the creative community desperately needs alternatives in the motion graphics world. Even open source projects that do survive and build stable communities still struggle with budget limitations. Take Inkscape. I've complained many times about its performance on Windows, the lack of certain basic tools despite how mature the program is, and the overall feeling that parts of the application do not feel like up to date. I'm not a developer, but I strongly suspect that with a larger budget, the team would redesign major parts of the rendering engine and modernize the architecture from the ground up. And then there is Godot. The engine is fantastic for 2D, but it's still widely acknowledged that its 3D pipeline isn't yet at the same level as something like Unity. More funding and more developers could dramatically accelerate the process. Now, of course, some open source projects do receive significant support. The Blender Foundation receives substantial donations and sponsorships. Krita has a dedicated foundation behind it. Even Inkscape occasionally receives grants. But these are exceptions. Most open source graphics software is built by small groups of passionate developers working with extremely limited resources. In most cases, there isn't even a full-time in-house development team. Because here's the thing, when open source projects do receive funding, they often can trade punches with the big guys, but passion alone can only go so far. Eventually, without fuel, a handful of talented developers will run into the reality of competing against multi-million-dollar corporations. And here's another big challenge. Open source software doesn't exist in isolation. It exists inside an ecosystem dominated by private companies that actively try to establish themselves as industry standards. Historically, companies like Adobe or Microsoft have aggressively pushed their software into schools, universities, and professional pipelines. Once enough people are trained in those ecosystems, alternatives become much harder to adopt, no matter the quality. That creates a huge uphill battle for open source tools. And yet, despite all of that, I still think there are very good reasons to choose open source software over technically superior proprietary alternatives. In fact, I think there are 5 major reasons. Number 1. Open source software is the perfect learning tool. This one is obvious. If you don't have money and want to start learning digital art or design, open source software gives you the access to the tools and workflows for free. You learn the fundamentals, you learn the paradigm, and later, if you decide to move to paid software, most of that knowledge transfers surprisingly well. There is also no pressure, no commitment. You just download the software and start learning. And sometimes, something funny happens. You get so comfortable with the free tool that when the time comes to upgrade, you realize you don't actually want to leave. That's exactly what happened to me with Inkscape. Number 2. Simpler software can sometimes teach better. Because of economics, open source programs often focus heavily on core functionality instead of piling on endless extra systems and integrations. That can actually make them easier to learn. You spend more time understanding the fundamentals of the tool and less time navigating layers of complexity. Of course, there are exceptions, Blender being the most famous one, but in general, many open source tools feel more focused and straightforward, and for beginners, that can be incredibly valuable. Number 3. The threshold of quality. This is a concept I came up with because I haven't seen being used or talked about. Sometimes a free tool becomes good enough that the extra features of the paid alternative stop mattering for most people. At that point, software choice becomes less about capability and more about preference. For me, Krita is the perfect example. Is Adobe Photoshop technically more powerful? I think so. But for digital painting specifically, Krita is so good that it rarely feels like a compromise. The experience is complete enough that preference becomes more important than those extra features. And the better open source software gets, the more often it crosses this threshold of quality for different people. Number 4. When the time to work professionally comes, preference matters more than you think. At the end of the day, software doesn't make the artist. If a program is stable enough and capable enough to support your workflow, nobody's forcing you to switch just because something else is technically superior. A lot of indie developers, who don't have to stick to the standards set by a company, often stick with open source tools simply because those are the tools they learned on. They know them and they're comfortable with them. So why waste time learning something new? That's exactly how I feel about Godot. Even if Unity is technically ahead in some areas, I simply enjoy working in Godot more. And for indie development, that comfort matters. Number 5. Digital freedom. This is the biggest reason for me personally. Open source software gives you ownership over your workflow. When open source software is released, it exists forever. Older versions remain available, the code remains accessible, the community can fork it and improve it, or continue maintaining it. You're not dependent on the business decisions of a corporation. Take Inkscape versus Affinity Designer, for example. Canva made Affinity Designer free as part of a strategy to compete with Adobe. But they are still a private company, and private companies make decisions based on business interests, not on generosity. Maybe in the future they decide the free model no longer benefits them and they cut it off. Maybe they lock features behind subscriptions like they've already done. Maybe they discontinue the app entirely. Maybe future versions stop supporting older operating systems. Maybe cloud functionality becomes mandatory. There are countless ways your expertise in that software can be rendered useless overnight, and you have no control over it. But with Inkscape, I know the software will always exist in some form. Even if development stopped completely tomorrow, someone could fork it, someone could continue it, and worst case scenario, the existing versions will still remain available forever. That kind of permanence matters, even if you don't feel it right now. So does open source software still matters? My answer is a very enthusiastic yes. There are absolutely valid reasons to choose open source tools over technically superior proprietary alternatives. And that's why, even after recognizing that Affinity Designer is in many ways a better piece of software, I still recommend people give Inkscape a serious try first. Because software isn't just about features, it's also about freedom, accessibility, ownership, community, and trust. So if you're deciding between Inkscape and Affinity Designer, or between any open source tools and a more advanced commercial alternative, I genuinely think it's worth trying the open source option first. You might be surprised by how far it can take you. And if you enjoyed this little essay, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more Inkscape and digital art content. Next video, I promise, we'll go back to more traditional tutorials. I just needed to get this off my chest. That's it for this video. Bye.